Hello, and thank you for tuning in to Memo's Weekly Review with me, Nasim Ahmed, and my regular guest, Mouin Rabbani. Hi, Mouin, how you doing? Good to see you again.
Hello, Nasim. Always good to be with you.
Likewise. Um, we have a lot to discuss. First, I want to begin with the situation in Gaza. We are 1 year into the genocide of Palestinians in Gaza. So I want to begin with that and then discuss the escalation in Lebanon, Iran, and the wider regional developments over the past week. But before I do that, I mean, for the benefit of our viewers, uh, things are so moving at a really fast pace. So whatever we discussed today, which is the fifth Saturday, the fifth, it may things would have actually moved on. So
It may and it
just
will.
it probably will. Things are moving so fast. So just bear in mind and keep a note of the fact that we are recording this on Saturday, and this show is most likely going to go out on a Tuesday. So with that said, Moin, let's begin with um, the situation in Gaza. We are near to the first anniversary of the beginning of Israel's genocide. What's I want you to specifically talk about the past year, but also commenting, if you can, on the new Al Jazeera documentary that just came out and the 99 doctors who have written to President Joe Biden uh, describing the horrific situation in Gaza. And they specifically mentioned that the death toll could be as high as 118,000. So let's just begin with that and get your thoughts on the 1 year anniversary and also the 2 points I mentioned about Al Jazeera, your comments, if you want, of the documentary, which really is a heart-shattering documentary. If you have the chance, do go and watch that documentary by Al Jazeera from last week, and also the comments by the letter by the 99 US doctors.
Well, I think if we want to assess the impact of the past year, it's perhaps useful to go back to October 6th, 2023. And in that environment, Palestine was no longer a significant issue, either regionally or internationally. It was widely assumed that Israel would remain free to unilaterally impose a permanent resolution of the question of Palestine exclusively on its own terms, both in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and with regard to the refugee question and so on. And that the Palestinians were not only essentially powerless to stop any element of Israel's agenda, but were also entirely isolated in the region and internationally. And I think the main thing that we have learned during the past year is that on the one hand, the Palestinians are absolutely not prepared to surrender. And that irrespective of what Israel throws at them, up to and including genocide, they are not simply going to renounce their inalienable rights and quietly scurry away. And secondly, that there can be neither peace nor stability in the Middle East and more broadly internationally without a resolution of the question of Palestine. We're back to what we always said and what we always knew, that unless you address the question of Palestine and achieve a just and durable peace settlement in which fundamental and inalienable Palestinian rights are at the center of it, there's never going to be either security or stability in the Middle East. And as we've seen, this can have also important global ramifications, not only political, but also economic and so on. I think the other thing that we've learned during the past year is what an absolute charade the rules-based international order, which was mobilized so centrally in the case of Ukraine, what an absolute charade it is. That it basically means rules, regulations, international law only apply to others, not to the West and its friends. We've seen this in the way that they have been absolutely dismissive of South Africa's genocide case against Israel before the International Court of Justice, even though a very large majority of international Court of Justice judges, including its American president, found that South Africa had presented a plausible case. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, the self-appointed guardian of international law, simply dismissed it with a wave of the hand as meritless. We've seen the same with the way that Israel's Western sponsors and allies have tried to bully the International Criminal Court into rejecting the prosecutor's application for arrest warrants of Israeli leaders and so on, basically saying the court only has jurisdiction to go after Palestinians, and Israelis should continue to enjoy complete impunity and lack of accountability for any war crime, any crime of humanity that they choose to perpetrate against the Palestinian people. That's really the West's position. Israel has the right to do anything it wants, up to and including genocide against the Palestinian people, and the only crime are the efforts to hold Israel accountable for its actions. And those are things that, again, we arguably always knew and always said, but they have been clarified to an extraordinarily further degree during the past year. I think we have also learned other things that perhaps we didn't know before. I mean, the speed and scope of mobilization, particularly in Europe and North America, in support of Palestinian rights and against these Israeli crimes, has been something that I think many of us never expected to see in our lifetimes. On the flip side of that, the absolute paralysis, to put it politely, of Arab governments and the Arab state system and the Arab League, which doesn't even deserve the term complicity, because it has simply been a self-imposed absence. That's something that perhaps took people by surprise. But against that, we've also seen popular opinion mobilized and movements in various countries of the Middle East mobilizing not only to express support for the Palestinians, but to take concrete actions in their support. So just very briefly, those would be my headlines. Of course, we can discuss it a lot further in terms of what has happened and how it's happened. I mean, I think a key issue, of course, is the Gaza Strip no longer exists. It has literally been wiped from the face of the earth and made into a territory that is, by design, no longer fit for human habitation. And it's an open question whether any efforts could make it once again fit for human habitations, and how this society is going to reemerge and reconstitute itself, given the extraordinary intensity of violence and trauma imposed against it. And here again, we've learned there are no red lines. Anything Israel chooses to do against the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, whether it's mass murder and genocide, the unprecedented killings of journalists, of healthcare workers, of aid workers, and so on, the systematic destruction of the healthcare system, of civilian infrastructure, of every university in the Gaza Strip, all of this will be tolerated, not tolerated, justified, supported, enabled under the rubric of Israel's sacred right to self-defense. So state terrorism has literally been redefined as legitimate self-defense.
You began by speaking about the Abraham Accords. it's Palestinians have demonstrated that you cannot simply leapfrog the issue and have a regional peace. So I think uh, that needs to be considered, especially given that many people hail the Abraham Accords and see it as a triumph, and also hail Donald Trump saying this guy is brought peace to the region. And I think the contrary is actually the true. If you look at what's happened since 7 October, and you have to put some of the blame on Trump and the so-called Abraham Accord for bypassing the Palestinian issue. And this again shows that, there is no way you could bypass the Palestinian issue to create regional peace. This has to be at the center of a formula for peace in the region. And the second point is about US complicity. And we saw two examples of that from this week. I think we speak about that every week, but this week there was leaked emails showing how the Biden administration were warned as early as October that Israel's plan in the Gaza Strip would amount to war crimes, crimes against humanity. Biden completely ignored that. There seems to be now a pattern. We were speaking, I think, last week about how Blinken ignored reports and warnings issued by his own department that Israel was violating international law by preventing US aid from reaching to Gaza. So, do you want to speak more on that pattern, how the US has
Yes.
completely ignored and enabled this genocide?
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, if you want to just add to that point, please do.
Yeah. Well, I think that when the history of the past year and the crisis that erupted on October 7th and everything that's happened since then, when that history is finally written, I think clearly U.S. Diplomacy, let's call it that for lack of a better term, is going to have a prominent place, both for standing stalwartly behind Israel during the entire diplomatic process that's falsely labeled the peace process from the early 1990s until today, in which rather than promoting a peaceful resolution of the question of Palestine, rather than encouraging or using influence with Israel to cease its consolidation of control over the occupied territories and to reach an agreement with the Palestinians that would actually see Israel withdraw to the 1967 boundaries and a Palestinian state emerge in the occupied territories. Rather than doing any of that, what we've seen is that the United States, with its European allies to be sure, have lost no opportunity to use this diplomatic initiative as a fig leaf to enable Israel to deepen and entrench its annexationist agenda in these territories. And that is an absolutely key part, I think, of the story that led to October 7th, because what happened on October 7th is that a crisis, it did indeed erupt on that day, but it was many years and arguably decades in the making. Secondly, the traditional approach to Middle East peace, if you will, had been that Arab-Israeli normalization would be the outcome of a resolution of the question of Palestine. In other words, once Israel finally crosses the bridge and reaches a resolution with the Palestinians, then after that, Arab states would normalize relations with Israel. This was, for example, the core part of the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002 that Israel immediately and categorically rejected. What the U.S. did during the Trump administration, and I think it would be unfair to lay responsibility solely at Trump's feet because it was in many ways a logical conclusion of U.S. diplomacy in previous years. What these so-called Abraham Accords tried to do was instead to reach Arab-Israeli normalization agreements, not in order to promote a resolution of the question of Palestine, but rather to marginalize and isolate the Palestinians so that Israel could unilaterally impose its conditions on them and essentially move forward with the annexation of the occupied territories without consequence. These normalization agreements were basically an effort to provide a halal certificate to Greater Israel. And I don't think you can write a history of the past year without assigning a prominent place to these two developments. Regarding the second issue you raised, let's put international law aside for a second, because I think the United States has made absolutely clear that international law is for suckers and for others, and that the US is too important to pay it any heed. What we're really talking about here is not international law. We're talking about US domestic legislation. And the other thing that we've learned, arguably learned yet again during the past year, is that the US government will go to any lengths necessary to subvert its own legislation, to undermine requirements that have been placed upon itself by its own domestic legislature in order to enable and support and participate in Israeli war crimes. We talked about that last week, and now, with every passing day, it seems more evidence is emerging that the U.S. was deliberately seeking to subvert its own laws, not international law, U.S. law, and legal obligations that apply specifically to the U.S. government about how U.S. military aid can be used, that it was basically sabotaging its own laws for one purpose only: to enable Israeli genocide against the Palestinian people. And I think what this demonstrates very clearly is how deeply invested the United States is geopolitically in ensuring Israel meets its objectives, because for the United States, the only red line with respect to Israel and the Palestinians is Israeli failure.
I mean, on top of that, I think one could make the argument that the US is also misleading its population. And we got an example of that last week in exchange between the spokesperson for the State Department, Matthew Miller. So he was asked a question about ceasefire. And Matthew Miller, he said that, we've never wanted to see a diplomatic resolution with Hamas. That was his answer to an exchange with one of the journalists. And then the journalist asked him, so what about all those examples where US tried to seek a ceasefire? And he said, well, I wish Hamas would come to the table. So again, it seems like you can't have it both ways. On the one hand, you cannot say you've never wanted any diplomatic resolution with Hamas, and on the other hand, say, oh, you wish Hamas would come to the table, and then in the same exchange, say that you want the complete annihilation and destruction of Hamas. I mean, there's contradiction after contradiction, and that exchange, I thought, was really revealing to the US motives and the role it's played. Of course, we know Biden will support any genocide as long as it makes Israel safe. But with the manner in which it's being done, there's so much duplicity, so much miscommunication, there's so much lying, frankly, that's coming out from the State Department.
Yes, I mean, in fairness to Miller and his endless prevarications, arguably what he was trying to say is that our bottom line is a Palestinian and Arab capitulation. And if diplomacy can help bring that about, then we will engage in diplomacy. But what we are not in any way interested in is an agreement that requires Israel to also stop any behavior that it wants to continue with. Listening to these U.S. Spokespersons, whether Miller or any of his cohorts, Kirby at the White House or others at the Pentagon and so on, it's quite amusing that to hear them constantly plead ignorance about what's actually happened. U.S. citizens get killed by Israel in the Gaza Strip or in the West Bank or in Lebanon. They know nothing about it because they have to wait to get the information from Israel. Israel conducts assassinations or particular military attacks. The U.S. wasn't informed or only learned about it when it was informed by the Israelis and is waiting to get further information. And how can you possibly take this seriously when the US, which has the most powerful intelligence apparatus in all of human history, was able to learn of Russia's intention to invade Ukraine months before it actually commenced, was able to warn Israel about an impending Iranian missile salvo last week, but somehow despite being very closely embedded in the Israeli security establishment, despite having an extraordinarily close intelligence sharing relationship with Israel, somehow knows absolutely nothing about anything Israel does, unless the Israelis pick up the phone and tell them during or after the fact that something is happening. And I haven't seen these spokespersons be challenged on this specific aspect of how can you claim that you didn't know of these things in advance, and to what extent have you actually participated in providing the intelligence, perhaps planning expertise, certainly the weapons, because the Israeli military is the U.S. armed and supported U.S. military. I haven't seen them challenged on what is obviously an attempt to evade reality.
So we are 1 year into the genocide in Gaza. Right at the outset, the Americans and the Western allies said we don't want an escalation. And now here, 1 year on, Israel is bombing Lebanon, it's bombing Syria, it's bombing Yemen, and there's a we're looking at a major escalation with Iran. So that was the major story from last week. Iran's, I should say, precision bombing of Israeli targets that's been spun into something completely different. That it was an Iranian failure. I mean, if you look at this from if you have in a reasonable way, you'd conclude that Iran targeted what it wanted to target. The message it was sending that we have precision missiles. If we wanted to cause damage, we can cause damage, but we're not doing that. We are targeting military installations. That's the message that should be sent. But instead of that, the usual neocons in the New York Times and elsewhere, Bolton and others are calling for this full-on war with Iran. So what have you made of the past week, Iran's attack? How do you think Israel may respond to that? And also just the neocons just bloodthirsty for war with Tehran.
Well, Iran has been pursuing a policy of what it terms strategic patience, which basically means building up its own capacities, avoiding a direct military confrontation with either Israel or the United States, or for that matter, others in the region, of providing support to its coalition partners in the axis of resistance, but seeking to avoid certainly a full-scale war and supporting what has been an attritional war against Israel. So their calculations obviously changed, and the Iranians obviously concluded that the price of strategic patience and the price of inaction was becoming intolerably high compared to the price of taking action, which is something that they had scrupulously avoided doing, with the exception of one incident in April. So, what would have changed their calculations? Well, I think there are several things. I think the very severe blows that Israel successfully administered to Hezbollah and particularly its leadership and its general secretary, the assassination of its Secretary General, Hassan Nasrallah. And then it became clear that Israel's agenda was not, just to take out the Hezbollah leadership or to seek to push Hezbollah forces back beyond the Litani River in southern Lebanon, but to dismantle Hezbollah as a meaningful force in Lebanon and in the region as part of a broader campaign to dismantle the entire axis of resistance and to change the strategic equation in the Middle East. And my speculation is that what ultimately tipped the balance was a statement made by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu shortly after Nasrallah's assassination, in which he addressed the Iranian people, promised them that they would achieve their freedom and that freedom would reach them sooner than they imagined. And I think this set alarm bells ringing in Tehran, that here you have a very hubristic Israeli prime minister who may well be acting in close coordination with the Americans, who now thinks that he has neutralized Hezbollah and it's time to take on Tehran and seek to begin a campaign to pursue regime change in Tehran. And I think it is in that context that the Iranians wanted to send a very clear message: this far and no further. And yes, we have carried out a strike that was designed to expose your vulnerabilities and humiliate you and so on. But we by design did not seek to hit either civilian objects or civilian infrastructure. But bear in mind, Israel is a much smaller country than Iran. And if you hit back in any way, shape, or form, our next attack is going to be much more severe. Now, regarding the American angle to this, you're entirely correct that since the 7th of October, one consistent US policy, at least at the declarative level, has been to prevent regional escalation. The problem is that Israel has consistently undermined that policy in two ways. First of all, by rejecting a ceasefire in Gaza, it has made it impossible to achieve an agreement whereby all the other regional parties who became involved in this crisis would cease their involvement. And secondly, the US response has been not to put pressure on Israel to accept a cessation of hostilities in the Gaza Strip, but rather to engage in initiatives of its own to seek to batter these other members of the axis of resistance into ceasing their activities. And it's been an absolute failure. I mean, we've had the US and UK naval task force in the Red Sea now bombing Yemen for almost a year, and it has done absolutely nothing. They've been bombing Iraqi militias who, if anything, have escalated their attacks. And I think we now are facing a situation where the US, rather than being dragged further into the regional quagmire by Israel, may well have come to the conclusion that Israel's determination to redraw the strategic map of the Middle East, to fundamentally change the strategic equation in the Middle East. I think there are powerful forces in the US National Security Council and elsewhere in the Biden administration who believe this is now an agenda whose implementation can succeed and who are fully on board with it. And for that reason, I think we're now living in a very dangerous moment, particularly the next few months before Biden is carted out of the White House.
So, just continue with the end part of your answer. If there is a desire to redraw the balance of power in the region, do do you think the position taken by the Gulf countries and the other Arab countries over the past week kind of forecloses that? Because I was listening to a number of US officials. They're saying that if we could get the Arab countries, the Gulf countries on board, we could have a um, coalition of US and its allies against the axis of so-called resistance, and with that, we can remake the Middle East, democratize, whatever they want to call it. But now with the Arab countries saying that they want to remain neutral, Saudi foreign minister also saying that we want to begin a new chapter with Iran, live as brothers. Maybe it's all for the camera, who knows? But it seems like the Arab countries don't want to be drawn into this, especially the Gulf countries. They know what's at stake. With that said, do you think US could pursue the hawkish side anyway, pursue an aggressive agenda to redraw the balance of power in the Middle East if the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia in particular, including the UAE, who have also said they want to remain neutral, if they don't play ball?
I think it can. Look, these Gulf states have seen how Israel is not only not invincible and vulnerable, but can even defend itself against 180 Iranian ballistic missiles. And they understand full well, and they've had experience of this, both during their war against Yemen and during the Trump administration, that Iran is perfectly capable of hitting strategic infrastructure throughout the Gulf. And it is for this reason that they have adopted a position of neutrality and stated that they won't allow any state that launches attacks on Iran to use their airspace to do so. Now, my suspicion is that yes, they would like any initiative against to weaken Iran to succeed, and may even be cooperating with it within various covert ways. But they have very serious doubts about the willingness and commitment of the US to see this through, and they have even greater doubts about the capability of the Israelis. And so, therefore, it makes perfect sense, given that they would be the first ones to be hit. I mean, Iranian missiles are not going to be raining down on Berlin and Brussels and New York and San Francisco. They're going to be hitting these Arab states on the other side of the Persian Gulf, and it makes sense for them, of course, to publicly profess their neutrality and try to stay out of a conflict that could extract greater costs from them than from potentially any other party.
We'll move on. Just want to get your reflections on revelations by the Lebanese foreign minister, Abu Habib. So in an interview with Christian Amonpo, he said that Hassan Nasrallah had actually agreed to a ceasefire with the Israelis, and Israelis had also agreed to that ceasefire before his assassination. Despite that, Israel went and assassinated him. Just your thoughts on that? I mean, when I heard that news, it was another, for me anyway, another example of how Israel views peace initiatives as a peace offensive. We saw that in many examples with its treatment of negotiations with the PLO, Fatah, and Hamas. How any peace gesture Israel would see as some kind of a threat because it wants to radicalize the Palestinian response, present them as some kind of a extremists who they cannot negotiate with. Is this another example of that, where any gesture for peace and ceasefire is not something Israel could countenance, because ultimately the goal is the takeover of Palestine. The goal is regional domination.
I think it is, but I also have to say there's some things about this story that I'd like to learn more about, because, of course, Hezbollah's consistent position has been that it would only agree to a ceasefire with Israel if and when Israel agreed to a cessation of hostilities in the Gaza Strip. And if these reports are true, that Hezbollah had agreed to a separate ceasefire with Israel, that would be an absolutely massive climb down that would either suggests that Hezbollah had been so badly battered by Israel that it felt the need to take this decision, or it means that perhaps there were other elements to this initiative that we're unfamiliar with that would have tied it to developments in the Gaza Strip. So I find it difficult to comment on this because it's also, entirely possible that the Lebanese foreign minister was trying to demonstrate that Israel basically rejects diplomacy and ceasefire negotiations and was talking about talks that had not yet been concluded. So I'm not really prepared to jump to conclusions on that one.
Yeah, I think we can continue that in another conversation if more information comes out. But let's end with Netanyahu. And one thing that struck me from last week is how his popularity in Israel has been boosted by the regional escalation, the war with Hezbollah, Iran, and now Syria as well. Of course, he's been bombing Syria. Polls show that if Netanyahu, or if there was an election in Israel, the Likud would win, which is a huge comeback for Benjamin Netanyahu. And sometimes you have to wonder. I mean, at the end of back of his mind, maybe he's also thinking, his legacy. Did
Yes.
he want to? Did he want to um, just simply end his war with Gaza, because if he did that, then he would have gone down as a failure, as one of the most disastrous Israeli prime ministers ever. But now, with the escalation in Lebanon and elsewhere, he's now somehow become born again. So, legacy, I'm sure, plays a part in these kind of calculations. And so, what do you make of the fact that Netanyahu now has made a comeback? He's seen almost as a savior. He'd most likely win another election. And what do you also make of the fact that Western allies of Israel constantly point to Netanyahu as the problem? They say if only Netanyahu wasn't there, this issue would have been resolved. So, just get your final comments on
Well,
that.
it's a very interesting question. I mean, Netanyahu has certainly received a significant bump in his poll ratings because of Israel's successes in eliminating so much of Hezbollah's leadership in such a short space of time. And I think we also have to recognize that I think it was Diana Buttu who made the observation that Israel has become a genocidal society. So kind of, the more slaughter, the greater the bloodbath, the more popular the Israeli leader is going to become. I think what has happened in the past few months, at least is my own assessment, is that if you look back at the end of last year, um, in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, Israel's response was characterized by bloodlust, by revenge, by very quickly became apparent by genocide and by, as we were talking earlier, even U.S. civil servants already in the first month were able to conclude with confidence that U.S. Continued U.S. assistance to Israel would result in the U.S. being complicit in Israeli war crimes. But there wasn't much of a strategy at that point, aside from kill, 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 destroy, destroy, destroy. I think what has happened in recent months over the summer is that Israel has finally regained its footing and has adopted a clear strategy, which is to fundamentally transform the balance of power in the Middle East, to change the strategic equation, as we've just been discussing, to dismantle the axis of resistance by delinking it from Gaza, by dismantling its elements one by one, as we're seeing now in Lebanon, and ultimately by pursuing regime change in Iran. And we talked about Iran. I think the other element to bear in mind is that most people consider an Israeli response to the latest Iranian response to be more or less inevitable. It may well come on October 7th. And the Iranians have already committed that that will be with a stronger Iranian response. If all that happens, I think it's only a matter of time before the United States, true to form, becomes directly involved, and Netanyahu will have achieved his ultimate objective of engineering a direct US-Iranian military confrontation. And it bears recollection, the one who he succeeded with, it's not George W. Bush, it's not Donald Trump, but it is Joe Biden, who again yesterday was repeatedly bragging that he's been the most pro-Israeli US president in history, bragging about this in the midst of an intensifying genocide. But
Just to add to the bragging, and also seeming to appear as though he does not care that this is affecting the Kamala Harris's electoral victory. In the comments he made, it's like, yes, I've been the most pro-Israeli, and when someone questioned him that is harming the Democrats' electoral victory against Trump, he seemed nonchalant.
yes, well, these are principles he's prepared to pay a price for. If the price of complicity in Israeli genocide, if the price of ensuring Israeli impunity for its actions is losing the elections, then so be it. Because quite clearly, um, uh, supporting Israel's genocide and ensuring Israel's impunity is a more important objective than winning the next election. I think one can say it's that simple. But to get back to the issue of Netanyahu and his legacy, I do think legacy fits into this. And I'm one of those who has been pointing out that Netanyahu has a Churchill complex. Many Israeli and Western politicians do. They all want to be the next Churchill. Um, they think, of course, of the Second World War, not of the Bengal famine, though they're quite happy to do both. And then I think Netanyahu is particularly prone to this illness. And of course, many of his groupies in the US Congress and Europe are also, trying to promote him as the next Churchill. But then last week, I read a quite interesting interview with a former senior Israeli military officer and official, Giora Island. This is the same person who has been publicly advocating spreading epidemic disease in the Gaza Strip, who has been basically arguing for the total destruction of the Gaza Strip, of creating, literally, in his words, a humanitarian disaster as an instrument of war. So this is someone, who should be sharing ultimately a cell with Netanyahu or others in The Hague. Um, and when he was
Well,
asked
they're
about,
fast tracked into the Israeli elites. Let's just say
yes,
this kind of mind is
yes.
a fast track to the Israeli elites. Sorry.
Exactly. But what was interesting about that interview is when Ireland was asked about Netanyahu's Churchill complex, he says, actually, it's not a Churchill complex, it's an FDR complex, referring to the US President, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, during the Second World War. And when he elaborated on that, he said, the way Netanyahu looks at this is just like Roosevelt was the president of the US when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. And had he resigned or been forced from office at that point, Roosevelt would only be remembered for presiding over the disaster of Pearl Harbor, but rather he stayed in office and is now remembered, reverentially by most Americans because he took his country to the brink of unconditional victory during the Second World War, right before he died of illness a few months earlier. And so Ireland was basically making the case, I think quite persuasively, that Netanyahu sees it similarly, that only by making a fundamental strategic achievement, knocking out the axis of resistance and so on, then he will be remembered not for presiding over the unprecedented Israeli disaster of October 7th, but over what he achieved afterwards. Now, I think theoretically that makes a lot of sense. The only problem for Netanyahu is that, you know, Lebanon has a reputation as being a graveyard for Israeli hubris. And I think particularly after the assassination of Nasrallah, I suspect that Netanyahu has gotten just a little too overconfident for his own good. And, you know, Israel is much smaller than the United States. Um, uh, Pearl Harbor aside, Germany and Japan during the Second World War did not have the capacities to inflict damage on the US homeland that Iran would have on Israel. So, yes, I do think Netanyahu has these fantasies, but they're going to have a very difficult encounter with reality, I believe, if he goes through with them.
Hmm. I think people forget that the biggest protection the US has is the fact that it's got two oceans, you know, separating it from the rest of the world. That's the
Yes.
biggest protection it has.
Mm,
Israel doesn't have that protection.
mm.
So that was my guest, Mouin Rabbani, sharing his thoughts and analysis from the Middle East from the past week. Thank you, Mouin,
Thank
as
you.
always, and thank you for tuning in. See you in another conversation with my guest, Mouin Rabbani, next week in our weekly memo review show. Bye-bye.